Here's a presentation on Chapter 11, the endocrine system. The learning objectives for this week are: you should be able to describe the negative feedback system that controls the production of hormones, list the major endocrine glands and the hormones they produce, describe the structure and functions of the pituitary gland, describe the effects of growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, melanocyte stimulating hormone, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. You should be able to describe the structure of the thyroid gland, describe the effects of thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and parathormone. You should be able to differentiate between T3 triiodothyroxine and T4 tetraiodothyroxine, or thyroxine itself. List the three categories of hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. Describe the hormones produced by the pancreatic islet cells and describe the effects of each of those. Describe the effects of androgens, estrogens, and progestins. You should be able to list the hormones produced by the kidneys, the stomach, small intestine, placenta, thymus, and pineal gland, and know what they do as well. As always, make sure you understand the vocabulary fundamentals on page 273 and 274. You should be able to describe, define, or identify all of those terms as needed on your quizzes and examination. To start off with the endocrine system, we will say, quite frankly, it is a very complicated system. The endocrine system is probably the system that causes the most students the most grief and causes the most confusions because it is very, very complicated. There are hormones that do things, there are hormones that act against the hormones that do things, there are hormones that act against the hormones that do things against the other hormones that they may actually stimulate. So it gets really complicated, but we'll try to keep it as straightforward and as understandable as possible. As we talked about in Chapter 9 on the nervous system, that the endocrine system does work in conjunction with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis in the body. That is, to maintain tissue perfusion to all of the cells and organs and tissues. Endocrine glands are ductless. That means they don't have ducts or little tubes, and they secrete small amounts of hormones directly into the bloodstream. The hormones, once they are secreted into the bloodstream, will circulate throughout the body, and then they produce their effects when they act on specific target receptors. Endocrine glands will secrete their products onto the, exocrine glands, I should not read so fast. Exocrine glands, as opposed to endocrine glands, exocrine glands secrete their products onto the epithelial surfaces through ducts. So instead of going into circulation and circulating, they then secrete their products directly onto a free surface. I will now slow down a little bit. Again, to compare the endocrine system back to our old friend the nervous system responds quickly to stimuli. It's the fast system. It uses neurotransmitters as the chemical messengers. Neurotransmitters only have to bridge a very small synapse to produce their effect, and the effects are usually short in duration. On the other hand, the endocrine system is much slower to respond to stimuli. It does not react nearly as quickly as the nervous system does, but it does have a longer duration of effect. The hormones will hang around a whole lot longer. Hormones act as chemical messengers as opposed to neurotransmitters, and hormones often travel very long distances throughout the blood to produce an effect. They circulate through the whole body as opposed to a local synapse. Hormones are simply chemical messengers produced by endocrine glands, and they are released directly into the bloodstream, and they circulate. Hormones will only produce an effect when they bind directly to specific receptors on their target organ. Okay, and target organs can be very small, very precise, just very few receptors, or in some cases it's the whole body. They can affect the whole body as a whole. Cells that have receptors for one or more hormones are considered to be the target of that hormone, regardless of where the organ is in the body. So there are hormones that are released from the brain that may act on toenails or something. Okay, they can go a long way and have a profound effect. Get into specific types of hormones, and I want you to pay attention to this. This is important stuff. Number 1, peptide hormones. Peptide hormones are hydrophilic chains of amino acids. The receptors for peptide hormones are located on the cell membranes of the target organs. Peptide hormones, hydrophilic, they are chains of amino acid. They act on cell membranes. Steroid hormones are ones that are synthesized or made from cholesterol. They are hydrophobic and attached to a transport protein or a binding or bound hormone. Then the receptors are located inside the cell of the target organ. So with steroids, or ones synthesized from cholesterol, they are hydrophobic. They do not pass through cell membranes. They have to have a transport protein, and then that transport protein takes them inside the cell, and there they act on their targets. Monoamine hormones are also derived from amino acids, and in this case they will retain an amino group. Receptors for the catecholamines, remember catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, are on the cell membrane. Receptors for thyroid hormones, very powerful thyroid hormones, are located in the cell nucleus itself. We have several pictures from your book showing exactly what we talk about. Here's a cell, the cell membrane receptor. They have receptor sites. The hormone acts on the receptor site on the cell membrane. With intracellular receptors, we have a hormone that is then attached to a transport protein. That transport protein, or the hormone molecule itself, depending on what kind, will carry the hormone inside the cell through the cell wall, and there it will react on the nucleus or other receptor sites within the cell. Here's a picture of a cat, as you can probably tell, and it shows the major hormones. The major endocrine glands that produce the hormones. The pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, the adrenals, the kidneys, the ovaries, the pancreas, testes. And obviously one would assume that if this was a male cat it would just be testes, or a female it would just be ovaries, although rarely we can get the intersex that produce both. Great picture of that cat. Start off with specific glands, okay? And we're going to start off with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of the diencephalon of the brain. And the hypothalamus is a part of the midbrain, controls much of the activity of the very important pituitary gland, okay? A portal system of blood vessels links to the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to have two parts: anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Okay, and a portal system of blood vessels are going to link the hypothalamus to the anterior portion, anterior pituitary. Modified neurons in the hypothalamus will secrete and release inhibiting factors to the portal blood vessels. Each of these factors from the hypothalamus is specific for a particular anterior pituitary hormone. So really, much of the anterior pituitary is going to make hormones, but the hypothalamus is going to use releasing factors to inhibit, or if you take away the inhibiting part, increase the amount of hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary does work. Hypothalamus controls the release. There are modified neurons in the hypothalamus that also secrete two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay, so the hypothalamus itself in the midbrain is actually a hormone producer. It makes two hormones. It secretes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. ADH and oxytocin are transported to the posterior pituitary for storage. So the posterior pituitary, unlike the anterior pituitary, is simply a storage area. It just stores a hormone. ADH and oxytocin are released into the bloodstream by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus makes ADH and oxytocin, stored in the posterior pituitary. When the hypothalamus senses a need for one or both of them, it then sends a signal to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary will then release the hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. The hypophysis is the proper name for the whole pituitary gland. Okay, so hypophysis is the whole pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is often referred to as the master endocrine gland, the master gland of the body, which is somewhat paradoxical because, yes, as you're going to see, it produces a huge number of hormones and releases a whole bunch of hormones, but quite frankly, you can live without and get along with just fine without an anterior pituitary or a hypophysis or the whole pituitary. So, this is the one really important gland that you can live without. And the others, which aren't as important, you can't live without. Go figure. The hypophysis is two separate glands with different embryological origins, have different structures, and different functions. Okay? They come from two different types of tissues. They are two separate organs, really and truly. They just, when they originally discovered there was one gland and they couldn't differentiate that it was really two parts, so they just called it the pituitary gland, and they discovered it was an anterior part, a posterior part, and it really is just, they're totally different structures. The anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, a proper name for anterior pituitary is adenohypophysis, is the rostral or most cranial portion and produces hormones and will reduce those when they're stimulated. The posterior pituitary, or neurohypophysis, is the caudal portion and it stores and releases hormones when stimulated. Anterior makes hormones, posterior simply stores hormones. Here's a nice picture representation showing where the pituitary gland is in the body. Shows, to the left is rostral, nasal towards the front, and shows the relationship of the hypothalamic neurosecretory cells, make ADH, make oxytocin, carries them down, they're stored in the posterior pituitary, whereas the anterior pituitary is actively making hormones, and that portal system, the portal blood vessels, will then carry releasing factors that will tell the anterior pituitary when to release the hormones it has produced. And the anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, produces growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. And you need to know the letter acronyms for those particular hormones. You need to know what GH is, TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, and MSH. So we will use commonly just those abbreviations for those hormones. To go through those in a little more detail, growth hormone is also known as somatotropin or somatotropic hormone. You need to know those terms. Soma means body, troping or tropic means that it is a target. It has an affinity for, it likes. So growth hormone acts on the whole body. It promotes body growth in young animals And growth hormone helps regulate the metabolism of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates in body cells. Obviously, if you're going to grow and you're going to develop, you need to have a lot of control over how the building blocks, the proteins, the lipids, and the carbohydrates, are used. Growth hormone will encourage the anabolism, the buildup of proteins. It causes the release of lipids and storage and their breakdown. Okay, so we got to have that energy. And it discourages cells from using carbohydrates, especially glucose. So we're going to use more proteins. We're going to build muscle and body. Second one is prolactin. Well, as you would assume with a name like prolactin, it helps trigger and maintain lactation. The production and release of prolactin will continue as long as the teat continues to be stimulated by nursing or milking. Okay, so as long as the puppies are nursing, or the kittens are nursing, or the foal is nursing, or the calf is nursing, prolactin will continue to trigger and maintain lactation. When that young is, for whatever species, is weaned, then gradually prolactin will decrease and lactation will cease. Without prolactin, milk production stops and the mammary glands shrink and return to very near non-lactating status. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is also known as the thyrotrophic. It has an affinity for the thyroid gland, thyrotrophic hormone. TSH stimulates the growth and development of the thyroid gland. Got to have TSH for the thyroid gland to function. It stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its hormones, and TSH is regulated by feedback from the thyroid gland and by interaction with the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and the thyroid glands themselves. So thyroxin, T3, T4, is going to be extremely important in the body, and because of that, there is a very elaborate system to control its production, its release, and the amounts that are released. Either being hyperthyroid or hypothyroid is a bad thing. If you've ever seen some of these little hyper or hypothyroid cats in your practice, they are not a pretty sight. The Adrenocorticotropic hormone will stimulate the growth of the adrenal cortex and the release of some adrenal cortex of its hormones. The release of ACTH is going to be regulated by feedback, negative feedback, from the hormones of the adrenal cortex. And ACTH can be quickly and copiously released in response to stress. ACTH is the stress hormone, often referred to as that as well. Follicle stimulating hormone is named for its effect on females, and FSH stimulates oogenesis, the development of ova, in females, and stimulates the production and secretion of estrogen. So FSH is going to stimulate oogenesis. When the ova develop, they release estrogen, so you're going to get a lot of estrogen at that point. FSH stimulates spermatogenesis in males, so FSH, regardless of species or sex, is going to be a reproductive cell stimulator. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, completes the follicle development and maturation in the ovary. So FSH is stimulating those ova to develop, and LH is going to complete the development and finally will mature it. LH levels reach their peak when the follicle is fully mature, and then in high enough levels, LH causes the follicle to rupture and we have ovulation. Continued secretion of LH will develop the corpus luteum. If the animal becomes pregnant, in most cases the corpus luteum will remain intact. If the animal does not become pregnant, then the corpus luteum will slowly degenerate, become a little bundle of scar tissue, and we start the cycle all over again. Again, in males, there's going to be LH, and in this case, it's going to stimulate the interstitial cells of the testes to produce testosterone. Okay, so in males, LH causes the production of testosterone. It stimulates the production of the hormone that's going to give males secondary and primary male characteristics. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is associated with color changes in the pigment of reptiles, fish, and amphibians. And since most of our patients don't change colors that much, or particularly produce bright really colors, you don't see that bright red kittens with green fur patches or orange hair or stuff, it just doesn't happen. But in reptiles, fish, and amphibians, it plays a very major role. MSH allows rapid color and pattern changes in those species, and the administration of artificially large amounts of MSH will eventually cause darkening of the skin in mammals. I like this particular set of slides because, number one, it goes through all the hormone and its target organs, and it also gives you a good little summary of exactly what it does. So, for example, down there, FSH, the one at the bottom, in females stimulates the development of oocytes and induces ovarian secretion of estrogens, or the signs of heat, and in male stimulates the testes produce sperm. And again, we have luteinizing hormone. Yes, as you can probably tell from Prolactin, this came from a human book, but it's a really good summary, so just pretend that's just the first two mammary glands of a cat. ACTH, MSH. Moving to the posterior pituitary stores two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, oxytocin and ADH. Once they are produced in the hypothalamus, they are then transported along nerve fibers and stored in the posterior pituitary, and the hormones are released into the bloodstream in response to nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. A graphic representation from your text showing the brain of the cat, and then up there in the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Okay, those are two good terms to know. Paraventricular nucleus, supraoptic nucleus, those two neurosecretory cells or types of cells produce ADH, and they produce oxytocin, then they're carried along nerve fibers and stored in the posterior pituitary. Because the posterior pituitary has such a really good blood supply that the hypothalamus doesn't, that's why they're sent there, so that when they're needed, it's easy for them to get into circulation as opposed to hanging around the brain and hard to get into circulation. ADH helps prevent diuresis, anti-diuretic hormone. It helps the body retain water. It is released with the hypothalamus, and it is released when the hypothalamus detects dehydration. The hypothalamus senses that blood is getting too thick, and so we're getting dehydrated, so we need to retain more water, not excrete it in urine, so we release ADH. The result is that water is pulled out of urine, and the urine becomes much more concentrated. We're pulling water back in that otherwise would be urinated away. A deficiency of ADH causes diabetes insipidus. And diabetes insipidus is usually found in young animals. A lot of times they show up, if you're going to see it, around 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 weeks of age. They come in and they have polydipsy, polyuria. I mean, they've got their head in the water bowl all the time, and it's just running out the back end or out the penis as fast as they can drink it in. The one thing that distinguishes it primarily quickly from, well, several things, that distinguishes it from diabetes mellitus or sugar diabetes is that, number one, these animals are not polyphagic. They're not eating everything within sight. They're having normal appetites. And usually diabetes insipidus shows up much, much earlier in life than diabetes mellitus does. A schematic, you can pause and go through all this and follow the path, but basically what it's saying is that in the hypothalamus there are osmoreceptors. Osmo means pressure. They detect the blood pressure. When blood gets too thick, it's going to cause the hypothalamus to detect that. Then ADH is released. As then the opposite can occur when the blood gets too thin. Then ADH stops being released, and we urinate away more water and help control blood pressure. ADH is a real major contributor to intravascular blood pressure. In fact, it was trade named under the name of Pitressin, and was used a lot in the Korean War. And soldiers in the field would be injured, have a lot of blood loss. So they would give them Pitressin or ADH, and what that would do is that would inhibit loss of blood. It would increase the loss of urine, pull more water back into circulation, increase blood pressure. Another name for ADH is Pitressin. And here's another one showing the whole effect. Actually, it affects several areas. Mostly it pulls water out of urine, but it will also decrease water loss by perspiration, and it causes arterioles to constrict, which increases blood pressure. Again, those soldiers that are wounded, they're in shock, their vasculature is dilated wide open. We need to increase their blood pressure, and so we give them Pitressin or ADH, and that will then cause more water to be retained and arterioles to constrict, which will increase blood pressure, which is counter to shock. Oxytocin induces uterine contractions at breeding and especially during parturition. Stimulation of the teat by nursing or milking causes a release of oxytocin, and then that oxytocin causes milk to be quote-unquote let down from storage in the mammary glands and to flow to the teat. So when the calf starts to nurse, he starts sucking on the teat, and that then will cause a reflex release of oxytocin. Oxytocin then allows the milk to be released from storage areas high in the udder. It then flows down to the teat, and the calf gets breakfast, lunch, and or dinner. Another schematic representation, yes, this is a human book, showing you very much the same thing, and talks about what the effect of all of oxytocin and ADH does. Thyroid gland. The thyroid gland consists of two lobes in most species that sit on each side of the larynx, one left, one right. The lobes may or may not be connected by an isthmus or a little bridge of tissue. The thyroid gland produces two hormones in the follicles. There are thyroid hormone and calcitonin. Very important hormones. The thyroid hormones are made up of T4, tetraiodothyroxine, and T3, triiodothyroxine. Now, T4 that has 4 iodines on it, that's why it's called T4, tetra-4-iodoiodines. T4 is a prohormone which provides a circulating reserve or reservoir of hormone. T3 is actually the active hormone. Okay, so if you run out of T3 and you need more hormone, you've got T4, which can be very quickly converted to T3, and then it can be used in the body. Thyroid hormones regulate the metabolic rate of all the body cells. This is referred to as a caloriogenic effect. It burns calories. The more thyroid hormone, the more calories are burned, and it increases the metabolic rate. The thyroid hormones affect the metabolism of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. It's pro-protein, breaks down carbohydrates, burns lipids. There is an anabolic or synthesis of protein, depending on the diet. If you have enough protein in your diet, you can then use the amino acid building blocks to build more proteins. This helps maintain the homeostasis of blood glucose. A lot of us think that only insulin and glucagon does that. That's not true. Thyroid hormone also helps maintain blood glucose in very precise ranges, and it encourages the catabolism or breakdown of fats. We burn fats for energy. Very, very high energy source. A fairly complicated system showing what happens with the feedback system of thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary. When it's released, it causes the thyroid follicle to release T4 and T3 and T4, and then when T3 and 4 levels get high enough, then that stops the secretion of TSH. This is a negative feedback system. And if by now, if you haven't figured out negative feedback systems, be sure and go back through and understand that this is the way the body balances things. Hormones in the body are never constant. They're always up and always down and always up and always down. And this negative feedback system keeps them within a normal range. It does not have to be a precise number, just has to be in a good controlled range. And this negative feedback systems is the way that happens. And down there at the bottom it says actions of thyroid hormones, increases basal metabolic rate, stimulates the synthesis of sodium potassium ATPase, which breaks down ATPs, increases body temperature, that's caloriogenic. If you burn more calories, your body's going to get warmer, stimulates protein synthesis, and so on. And if you've been in practice very long, you've seen some hypo or hyperthyroid patients. And when you figure out what thyroid does, then it makes perfect sense, the symptoms that you will see. The other hormone produced by the thyroid gland is calcitonin. And calcitonin is produced by C cells located between the thyroid follicles, C cells, calcitonin, and it works with the parathyroid gland to maintain stable blood calcium levels. Calcium is absolutely essential to the health, well-being, functioning of the body. It's essential for synapses to function. It's essential for muscle to contract. It does so many things. And in low amounts, well, you get dead. In too high amounts, you get dead too. So not only is it necessary to keep the animal alive, but it's necessary for all the systems to work well. And so we have a very complicated, very precise system of keeping calcium levels available. And the two ways we do that is with parathormone and with calcitonin. And calcitonin helps prevent hypercalcemia, too much calcium, by helping move calcium from the blood into bone tissue where it can be stored safely. So if your blood calcium gets way too high, if you drink like 72 gallons of milk for lunch, well, all that calcium is going to hit your bloodstream. The body doesn't like it because it can kill you, and so it shunts it off, stores it in calcium and in the bone, and the calcium in bone can then later be called upon if we need a reserve of calcium, because being hypocalcemic is just as bad as being hypercalcemic. Another chart or table showing you the summary of the hormones of the thyroid gland. In this case, T3 and T4 and calcitonin. And under calcitonin, control of secretion, high calcium levels stimulate secretion, low blood calcium levels and inhibit secretion. And it lowers blood levels of calcium and phosphate by inhibiting bone reabsorption by osteoclasts and by accelerating the uptake of calcium and phosphates into bone matrix. We pull calcium out of circulation, store it in bone. Parathyroid gland, PTH or parathormone, is produced by the parathyroid glands, which are located near or on the thyroid glands. PTH works with calcium to maintain normal blood calcium levels. PTH causes the kidney to retain more calcium. It pulls calcium out of urine, keeps it back in circulation. Causes the intestines to absorb more calcium, so we're pulling calcium out of digestion into circulation. It will pull stored calcium from bone. We've stored all that bone due to calcitonin. Now we can pull it out, and it has exactly the opposite effect of calcitonin. If blood calcium levels get too high, calcitonin brings them down. If blood calcium levels get too low, parathormone brings them back up. Okay, and you're probably familiar with eclampsia, milk fever, depending on what species you want to talk about it. Human eclampsia is different from animal eclampsia, so if you've ever had human eclampsia, forget it. We're talking animal eclampsia now, but most common, like in bitches nursing large amounts of puppies. She's making milk, cannot make enough milk. I mean, she's pulling every bit of calcium she can get out of it, and when that calcium finally in her blood cannot be restored anymore, then she shows the signs of eclampsia. And if you're not familiar with eclampsia, you need to go look up eclampsia. Same thing with calves and milk fever. Okay, so calcitonin and parathormone work together to maintain blood calcium levels. Calcitonin will decrease it, parathormone will increase it. Again, a picture from a human book, but human, thyroids and parathyroids are pretty much the same as everybody else. It all works the same. And you can follow the chart around, pause and look and see high calcium levels, low calcium levels. We really work hard to keep calcium within a normal range, because without that, you're going to find very quickly that bad things happen. Bad things happen. The adrenal glands, and I do love my adrenal glands, are located on the cranial poles of the kidneys. The adrenal glands have an outer adrenal cortex and an inner adrenal medulla. Essentially, they're two separate glands. Totally different hormones, totally different functions. The outer and the inner. The adrenal cortex, this is important stuff. The adrenal cortex produces glucocorticoids. And of the glucocorticoids, what often people refer to as the steroids, hey, my dog's itching, he needs a steroid shot, are cortisone, cortisol, and corticosterone. You might want to know the three major glucocorticoids naturally occurring are corticosterone, cortisol, and corticosterone. Glucocorticoids cause a general hyperglycemic effect. They kick sugar up. They will help maintain blood pressure. That's why they're often used in shock patients. The old story, no shock patient should ever die without steroids. And helps the body deal with stress. But they are meant for short-term use only. They are not meant for long-term use. The second class of hormones produced by the adrenal cortex are the mineralocorticoids. And of those, aldosterone is by far the most important. And it helps regulate the levels of blood electrolytes. And finally, there are sex hormones, both male and female, androgens and estrogens. And those rarely come into play. Every so often you'll get like an adrenal tumor or something, and it'll kick out too many estrogens or too many androgens, but it's pretty rare. Now, be sure you understand the difference between Addison's disease and Cushing's disease. Addison's disease is hypoadrenal-corticoism. And that is usually manifested in patients by very severely altered levels of electrolytes because there's no aldosterone to help regulate them. Cushing's disease is hyperadrenal-corticoism. Cushing's disease occurs fairly commonly. If you ever see a dog in an Addisonian crisis, one that's in the throes of Addison's disease, you'll probably never forget it. And if you ever see those hypercortical, those Cushing's dogs, then you're probably never going to forget them either. Okay? Make sure you understand the difference between those two, and if you haven't had a chance to go study a little bit of the signs and symptoms of this stuff, go look it up. They are two fascinating diseases. They are absolutely essential to understanding the whole working of the adrenal cortex. Here is a diagram table showing a summary of adrenal gland hormones. The adrenal cortex hormones, mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone, glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol, and the androgens, mainly DHEA. Your book really didn't go in that much into the adrenal medulla hormones, so I really wanted to throw those in here real quick. We talked about them when we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The adrenal medulla, the inside of the adrenal gland, produces epinephrine and norepinephrine from specialized cells called chromaffin cells. And sympathetic preganglionic neurons, and if that doesn't make sense, go back and review your sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine, preganglionic receptors, always acetylcholine, which will then stimulate the secretion or the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And they produce effects that enhance those of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system during stress. Okay? The sympathetic system is the engine that drives many body functions. The adrenal medulla is like a turbocharger on that engine. And so when it kicks in, the power and the effect goes up tremendously. Okay? So if you have any questions about that, again, you can refer back to your sympathetic and parasympathetic system, but the adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine that work in conjunction with the sympathetic nervous system to fight stress, fight or flight types of things. And there's our old friend, the pancreas. The pancreas is a long, flat, kind of nondescript looking organ located along the greater curvature of the stomach. The pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions, does a lot of things, functions in hormones, also functions in the digestive system rather significantly, and we'll get to that later. The endocrine part, which is the one we're going to worry about now, is made of the pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans. I still love the term islets of Langerhans. Poor old Langerhans did a lot of work and he deserves some recognition. Then they just want to take away his name. That's not fair. Anyway, there are three major types of cells in the islets of Langerhans. There are alpha cells, which produce glucagon. Beta cells produce insulin. And delta cells produce somatostatin. The exocrine portion, which we talked about before, that produces things down a tube into a free surface, produces digestive enzymes. Digestive enzymes are produced in the pancreas. They are then secreted into the small intestine where they help with the digestion of food. So remember alpha, beta, delta cells and which hormones they produce. Of those, the one we worry about most often and the one we're most going to concern ourselves with is insulin. Insulin lowers the blood glucose levels. It causes glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids in the blood to be absorbed into body cells. Of those, glucose is going to be the most important. Insulin is like a key. That key fits into receptor sites and it then turns the lock and glucose can then enter the cell. It's locked out till insulin comes along. If there's a lack of insulin, or if there's too little insulin, or if it will no longer, that lock will no longer accept the insulin key, then glucose builds in the blood and builds in the blood and the blood builds in the blood. And if you see these cats come in with diabetes mellitus, you know the classic signs are polydipsia, polyphagia, and polyuria. They are drinking too much water, they are peeing too much water, and they are eating their heads off and are getting skinnier by the day. Okay, because you can't get the sugar into the cells that they're trying to digest and absorb. And you put these things, a dipstick on urine, and it turns about 7 shades of blue, green, orange, or whatever, because it's huge amounts of sugar in the urine. And then if you pull a blood glucose and you get a blood glucose of 450 or 550 or 650, you're probably pretty sure what you got right now. Glucagon raises blood glucose levels. It stimulates the liver to convert glycogen to glucose and stimulates gluconeogenesis, or the production of sugar. So if this animal is hypoglycemic, it tries to get the blood sugars back up. Somatostatin is an inhibitory hormone that inhibits the release of growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, and decreases the rate of gastric emptying. It reduces smooth muscle contractions and blood flow within the intestine. Okay, so somatostatin has an inhibitory hormone that inhibits the release of growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, some others, and it helps regulate those hormones in the body. Here is a table showing you how blood sugar is regulated in the body using both glucagon and insulin. And you can pause, go through this, number 1, 2, 3, 4, back up to 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, and you see that again, blood glucose is never completely static. There's a range of blood glucoses. Depending on different authors and different species. It's going to be between 100 120 and 100 to 70 or 80, depending on this and that, and we try to keep it within that range, and we usually do a really good job. The glucagon insulin thing works great. It's when insulin gets way out of whack, or we don't have any, and we have big problems. Diabetes mellitus, or often referred to as sugar diabetes. Another table summarizing glucagon, insulin, somatostatin. The book really doesn't talk about pancreatic polypeptide. This is more important in human medicine, and you can read through what it does, but it also plays a role more in human medicine than in veterinary medicine. The gonads themselves, besides being reproductive organs, and when we get to the reproductive system, certainly pay a lot of attention there, but they are endocrine organs. They produce hormones. The reproductive gonads are testes in male and ovaries in females. The two testes are located in the scrotum, and the seminiferous tubules inside the testes are the site of spermatogenesis, where spermatozoa are actually made. Interstitial cells, the ones kind of between things, in the testes are responsible for production of testosterone. Remove the testes, most of the testosterone goes away. You can still get a little bit from the adrenal cortex, but 99.9% of it is removed with the organ, with the testes. The ovaries produce ova, obviously the eggs, and hormones in periodical cycles, depending on species. And the cycles are controlled by, as we said before, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The ovaries during FSH stimulation will produce estrogens, primarily estradiol and esterone. Remember those two, estradiol and esterone. Progestins, progesterone, and relaxin. The follicle cells in the ovaries that are developing the ova will produce and release the estrogen. FSH stimulates the ovarian follicles to develop. As the follicle develops, more and more and more estrogen is produced. The follicle grows, secretes the estrogen. As the follicle grows, the amount of estrogen produced will increase as well. In response to the rising estrogen level in the anterior pituitary, it will finally decrease the amount of FSH and increase LH production. So when estrogen levels get high enough, it triggers a response in the anterior pituitary, FSH backs off, LH kicks in. When LH peaks when the follicle is fully mature, it's ready to ovulate, ovulation occurs, and the corpus luteum probably will form regardless, but whether or not it's maintained will depend on if pregnancy occurs or not. FSH builds the follicle, LH causes luteinizing or rupture of the follicle, and the corpus luteum produces progesterone. The progestins are a group of hormones produced by the corpus luteum. Progesterone is the main progestin produced. It's the most important. In a pregnant female, the corpus luteum will produce progesterone, which is necessary to maintain pregnancy. That's true in all but 3 species. And if pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum atrophies, withers away, dies, becomes a corpus albicans, or a simple little collection of scar tissue. There are species where pregnancy is maintained by hormones other than progesterone in the corpus luteum. And finally, relaxin helps cause relaxation of the ligaments surrounding the birth canal so that the baby can get out easier, and will also help promote mammary gland development. So as more of it is produced, the pelvic ligaments start to relax, and the mammary glands start to develop. Table showing summary, estrogens and progesterone, what they do, relaxin, what it does, inhibit, obviously inhibits the secretion of FSH. Testicular hormones are, going to be testosterone and inhibit as well. The kidneys themselves function not only in the renal system next week, but also as a part of the endocrine system. And they produce one really important hormone called erythropoietin, EPO. The production and release of EPO is stimulated by renal hypoxia. When the kidneys aren't getting enough oxygen, it is going to produce and release EPO, and EPO circulates, goes to bone tissue, and in red marrow stimulates the production of more red blood cells, which are going to then carry more oxygen back to the kidney. The kidney is both a oxygen as well as a pressure sensitive organ. It's got to have blood pressure to function, it's got to have oxygen to function, and if it don't get its oxygen, it gets real cranky and makes its own by stimulating red blood cell production. And it's going to increases an O2 delivery to the kidney, which will reduce EPO production and release. So as the kidney finally gets enough oxygen, EPO production will drop. If you see some of these old cats with very chronic renal disease, I mean their kidneys are all wiped out anyway. They wipe out so much of the kidney that it no longer is even capable of producing EPO, and these cats come in are extremely anemic and are probably, if they're going to be maintained, need blood transfusions, which cats do not really like at all. Stomach produces gastrin. Well, the stomach produces a whole bunch of stuff, but these are the ones we're going to worry about. The stomach produces gastrin. Gastrin is produced by the cells in the stomach wall. Gastrin is important in the digestion of food. Secretin is also stimulated in the stomach, is stimulated by food in the stomach and causes the release of hydrochloric acid, digestive enzymes, and increases the muscular contractions of the stomach wall. So if you get a big meal, you're going to get a lot of secretin release, and that's going to then cause the stomach to do a better job of digesting the food. The small intestine will release two major hormones in response to chyme, or that food coming out of the stomach, in the duodenum. Secretin stimulates the pancreas to secrete fluid that helps neutralize the acids and chymes. This is going to be very high in bicarbonate ions. And cholecystokinin stimulates the pancreas to release its digestive enzymes. They're going to continue the digestion of the food. Both cholecystokinin and secretin slow the movement of chyme and stimulate the gallbladder to send bile to the small intestine. And bile is necessary for the emulsifications and eventually digestion of fats. The placenta. The placenta surrounds the developing fetus and is the life support system of the fetus. We'll get into that when we get into the reproductive system. It acts as an interface between the fetuses and the mother's circulatory system. The placenta will produce hormones to support and maintain pregnancy. So in some species, again, we're going to have to rely on the placenta to produce the hormones that maintain the pregnancy, not corpus luteum. The hormones are estrogen, progesterone, chorionic gonadotropin in some species, and relaxin in some species. I don't care that you remember what those species are right now, just know that that's a possibility. That will be dealt with in greater detail later. Our old friend the thymus. The thymus is a large organ in the craniothoracic cavity of young animals. As that animal gets older, it atrophies with age until it turns up nothing to a small bundle of scar tissue. The thymus produces thymosin and thymopoietin, which stimulate precursor cells in the thymus to transform into T lymphocytes. Those T lymphocytes then seed throughout the body into several different types of tissues, mainly into lymphoid tissue, things like lymph nodes, even into the spleen and liver. You're going to find T cells into a lot of places. Bone marrow. T cells play an essential role in the immune integrity of the animal. No T cells, very poor immunity. The pineal body is a small organ, a small area associated with the brain, kind of hangs off the back of the brain, kind of a funny look. They call it pineal because it looks like a pine nut, looks like a pinon nut. Melatonin is a hormone that's produced by the pineal body. Melatonin helps regulate the body's biological clock. It affects mood and sleep-awake cycles. It may also play a role probably does play a major role in the timing of seasonal estrous cycles. If you live in a far northern climate, and a lot of people suffer from SAD, seasonal affective disorder, they will take melatonin in an effort to help regulate the biological clock. The more sunlight you have, the more melatonin is produced, and it will often affect mood. And if you go into darkness a lot of people get real cranky. It is not a happy day. Prostaglandins, we could spend hours and hours and hours and days on prostaglandins, but we'll keep it short at this point and come back to those guys later. The prostaglandins are hormone-like substances. They're not true hormones, they're hormone-like substances that are derived from unsaturated fatty acid. These types of tissue hormones are produced in a wide variety of body tissues and travel only a small distance. And every day you find a new prostaglandin that's produced in a new organ. They are just ubiquitous throughout the body. There are 9 major groups based on their molecular structure. Don't worry about that now. Prostaglandins influence blood pressure, blood clotting, and in our case, most importantly, inflammation. Okay, this is where a lot of inflammation and pain come from. This is how NSAIDs work, is by blocking prostaglandins. They may influence the functions of the gastrointestinal tract, the kidneys, and the reproductive system. We worry about them causing gastric ulcers, and they are hard on the kidneys and will wipe out nephrons if necessary. A summary of organs produced by other organs and tissues that contain endocrine cells. Excuse me. This would include gastrin, GIP, secretin, cholecystokinin, human chorionic gonadotropin, estrogens, progesterone, human somatotropic, or HCS. The kidneys, we didn't talk much about renin. We'll talk a lot about renin when we get to the kidney next week. EPO, the heart, atrial natriuretic peptide decreases blood pressure. Leptin. And we're going to finish up this chapter with a tape figure that I found in one of the human books that summarizes stress. And we worry about this a lot, especially when we get into things like shock, or any kind of either psychological or physiological stress. Everything from poor nutrition to fireworks going on the 4th of July. And you can follow it through as we start off with stressors that affect the hypothalamus, that then affects the anterior pituitary, which then sends out hormones, ACTH, human growth hormone, TSH. They have a response. Also, sympathetic centers in the spinal cord, the fight or flight thing, hits the adrenal cortex. That kicks epinephrine and norepinephrine. They support and prolong the fight or flight responses, and they list what those responses are. There's the turbo on the engine of the sympathetic nervous system. It really kicks it up, and you're going to see what's going to happen with all that stuff. That's all stuff that will happen in stress. If it is short-term stress, the body will very quickly return to normal and things go well. However, if this is long-term stress, if the stressors that are producing the stress do not go away, this will produce long-term, profound, and detrimental effects in the body. So, short-term stress, it's okay. Long-term stress, bad things happen. Okay, bad things happen. So you can follow that through. I think that's one of the more fascinating charts we have. And this ends the presentation on Chapter 11 on the endocrine system. And I hope it was helpful. And if you go through your book and read and maybe do a little research on your own, well, the endocrine system should start to make more and more sense. If you're working in practice and as you go along and as you see more cases of problems with the endocrine system, things will start to fall into place.